Imagine a country where the average citizen makes over $160,000 a year.
Right, just an unfathomable amount of money for an average.
Exactly. I mean, imagine a place where the life expectancy is nearly 84 years old, where extreme poverty it basically doesn't exist.
It sounds like, a utopian sci-fi novel.
It really does.
Yeah.
But I want you to imagine that this exact same country, this glittering jewel of prosperity, is ranked 103rd in the world for gender equality.
Yeah, it's wild.
I mean, we're talking about a place that loses out on gender parity to like dozens of developing nations that have just a tiny fraction of its wealth. So today, we're dissecting the great paradox of Liechtenstein.
What's fascinating here is the absolute cognitive dissonance of those two realities existing in the exact same place.
Right.
Because it completely shatters this really common, very comfortable assumption we make about human progress. For decades, the consensus has essentially been that, that just accumulating a ton of national wealth will automatically guarantee a leap in social parity.
Like if a country gets rich enough, equality just naturally follows.
Exactly, as an inevitable byproduct. But Liechtenstein proves mathematically and structurally that this assumption is it's completely false.
So what is our mission today? For you listening, whether you're commuting or, working out, we are taking you on a massive journey through the past 30 years of global human development.
Yeah, we've got a mountain of data from the United Nations here.
We do. Covering 1990 all the way to 2023. We'll look at the whole globe and then zoom in microscopically on this tiny, ultra-wealthy Alpine nation.
Right, using Liechtenstein as the ultimate stress test for our assumptions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, if you picture a giant pyramid of global development, Liechtenstein is sitting comfortably right at the glittering peak at number 17.
But then on the Gender Development Index, they're at 103, with a giant red question mark connecting the two.
Yes. How does a country sit at 17th globally in overall development, but plummet in freefall to 103rd when you factor in gender?
Well, to understand how a country can exist in two such radically different positions at once, we first need to understand the rules of the game.
Right. The metrics.
Yeah. We have to define exactly how global researchers are actually measuring human success. Because, if you measure the wrong things, you get a completely distorted picture of reality.
Okay, so if we're going to unpack this mystery, we need to know the tools we're working with. I want you to visualize a giant radar chart in your mind.
Like one of those five-sided pentagon charts.
Exactly. Like in video games to show a character's stats, strength, agility, whatever.
Yeah.
Picture a giant five-sided radar chart for human civilization. Each point is a different way to measure success.
That's a perfect way to visualize the framework here. The UN uses this multidimensional approach because human life is, it's multidimensional.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second.
Go for it.
Why do we even need 5 different indices? I mean, for most of the 20th century, didn't we just look at gross domestic product and call it a day?
We did, yeah.
Isn't looking at how long people live and how much money they make enough? Why complicate it with a 5-sided radar chart? It feels, I don't know, like academic overkill.
It's a fair question. Economists debated it for years. But relying just on GDP it's like trying to judge the comprehensive health of a person just by looking at their bank account.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. A person might be a multimillionaire, but they could be dealing with a terminal illness or living in a toxic environment. Societies are the same. You can have a skyrocketing GDP while your working class is dying of preventable diseases.
So you need a broader baseline.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is the first corner of our radar chart, the HDI.
The Human Development Index.
Right. It doesn't just look at money. It combines life expectancy, expected and mean years of schooling, and gross national income, or GNI per capita.
Okay, so HDI is the baseline checkup. But HDI gives us this, glossy, high-level brochure of a nation. My question is, who actually gets to live in that brochure?
That is the crucial question.
Does everyone get the exact same deal?
And that's exactly why they created the second point on our chart, the GDI, or Gender Development Index. It's essentially the HDI, but viewed strictly through the lens of gender disparity.
So it splits the brochure in half.
Yes. It asks, are the men and women achieving that baseline health, education, and income at the same rate? If a country has perfect balance, the GDI score is exactly 1.0.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have the baseline and the gender lens. But gender is just one slice of the demographic pie. What about, class warfare?
The wealth gap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Billionaires versus working class families.
Yeah.
A country might have perfect gender equality, but if 5 families own 90% of the wealth, the average person is still struggling.
Precisely. Which brings us to the third point, the IHDI, the inequality-adjusted HDI.
The reality check.
The ultimate reality check. It looks at what happens to that shiny HDI score when we penalize a country for massive gaps between the rich and the poor. A high average income means nothing if it's all hoarded by a tiny elite.
So the IHDI forcibly adjusts the score downwards based on inequality.
Yeah. Exactly. It shows the actual lived level of development for the average citizen.
Okay, so IHDI penalizes hoarding. But wealth isn't just about what's in your savings account, right? It's about who runs the bank. Does any of this track actual societal leverage?
It does. That's the fourth point. The GII, or Gender Inequality Index.
Mhm.
It measures the loss in potential development due to inequality in power dynamic.
Power dynamics like what specifically?
Three things: reproductive health, social empowerment, and the labor market. So it tracks maternal mortality, the share of seats in parliament held by women, and active labor force participation.
So it's an index of leverage. Who actually runs the country?
Exactly. And finally, if we're building these massive economies, banks, hospitals, parliaments, we are probably burning a ton of coal and gas to do it.
Right. Which brings us to the fifth point, the newest one, the PHDI.
The Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI. It represents the hidden environmental cost of our success.
Because you can't be successful if you're destroying the planet you live on.
Exactly. It adjusts a baseline based on a country's carbon dioxide emissions and its material footprint.
Okay, so there's our five-sided chart. Health and wealth, gender parity, economic equality, power distribution, and ecological survival.
Right.
Now that we know the rules, before we dissect Liechtenstein, we have to establish the global baseline. How has humanity as a whole fared in this 30-year marathon?
If we look at the macro data from 1990 to 2023, it's initially a story of monumental progress.
Okay.
The global HDI climbed from 0.60 in 1990 to 0.756 in 2023.
Wait, let me stop you there. It's so easy to hear 0.60 to 0.756 and just think, oh, a decimal went up. But let's translate that to reality.
Okay.
Global life expectancy. In 1990, it was 65.1 years. By 2023, it jumped to 73.4 years.
That's massive.
We basically gifted the average human being an extra 8 years of life compared to when the Cold War ended. 8 more years to, watch your kids grow up.
It truly is a miracle of modern medicine, and economically, the leap is just as profound. Global GNI per capita almost doubled. Yeah, adjusted for purchasing power parity, it went from about $11,200 in 1990 to over $20,300 in 2023.
Let me pause you. Purchasing power parity? Or PPP. We hear economists throw that around, but let's be totally clear. That means measuring how many actual loaves of bread that money buys locally, right?
Exactly right. Not just raw exchange rates, because a haircut in New York might be $40, but in Mumbai, it might be the equivalent of $3.
So PPP levels the playing field.
It does. It ensures that $20,000 represents the same actual standard of living anywhere, so the material wealth of the average human basically doubled.
Okay, so we're living 8 years longer, and we have twice the purchasing power. This sounds like a victory lap for humanity. The line graph is just going up.
It is a victory, but picture that rising line graph in your mind.
Okay.
It's climbing steadily for decades. It powers through the 2008 financial crisis, and then suddenly it hits a wall and violently plummets.
The pandemic.
Yes. 2020 and 2021. The COVID-19 pandemic wiped out years of hard-won growth. It's a stark reminder that progress is incredibly fragile. A single biological event can erase a decade of advancement.
It's a really sobering reality check. But even with the rebound getting us back to 0.756 in 2023, we have to bring in that third point of our radar chart.
The IHDI, the inequality tax.
Right. Because a rising average is great, but averages lie.
They absolutely lie. If you and a billionaire are in the same room, your average net worth is $500 million. But that doesn't help you pay rent.
Exactly. So what happens when we adjust that global score for the people being left behind?
The data reveals a really harsh truth. When you adjust for inequality, that global HDI of 0.756 drops violently to an IHDI of 0.590.
Ooh, that's a massive downgrade.
It is. It tells us that because the fruits of development aren't distributed evenly, the lived reality for the average person is significantly lower than the top-line numbers suggest.
So if we look at the human inequality coefficient, are we closing the gap at all?
Slightly. It went from a 24% loss in 2010 to roughly a 21.6% loss in 2023. But that progress is just agonizingly slow.
And what's the main culprit? Health outcomes, education.
While those matter, the absolute primary driver is income inequality. This single factor accounts for a devastating 30.35% loss in global development potential.
30%. People talk about a leaky bucket where wealth pours in but leaks out.
Right.
But 30%, it's more like humanity built this massive state-of-the-art reservoir for progress. We're pouring millions of gallons of wealth into it.
But the foundation is uneven.
Exactly. The concrete was poured completely unevenly, so all the water sloshes to one side, where a tiny fraction of people have an ocean to swim in, and everyone else is scraping moisture off dry concrete.
That's a much more accurate metaphor. We are incredibly efficient at generating wealth, but disastrously inefficient at distributing it.
Which naturally brings us to the global gender gap. If income inequality is tilting the reservoir globally, how does this look when we divide the world strictly into men and women?
Let's look at the GDI data.
Now, I'm going to push back before you even give me the data. Is it actually improving? Because I look at who runs Fortune 500 companies, and it feels like we're treading water.
Your skepticism is justified, but the data from 1993 to 2023 tells a story of incredible triumphs completely shattered by stubborn failures.
Okay, lay it on me.
The overall global GDI did improve, from 0.90 in 1993 to 0.955 in 2023.
So we are inching closer to 1.0 parity. What's driving that? It can't be the economics.
It's education. This is the great victory. In 1990, a female child could expect about 10.8 years of schooling globally, while a male child expected roughly 12 years.
A structural gap right from birth.
Right. But by 2023, women's expected years of schooling globally hit 13.1 years. It actually surpassed men's expected schooling of 13.0 years.
Wait, I want you to really absorb that. Globally, taking into account every country on Earth, women are now expected to spend slightly more time in school than men.
It's a seismic achievement. We won that specific battle.
And I feel a but coming, if we connect this to the broader picture.
The reality betrays the progress. Let's look at income for 2023. Despite equal or better education, the global GNI per capita for men is $25,750.
And for women.
A meager $14,943.
Let that sink in. Men at almost 26 grand, women under 15 grand. That is nearly a 50% pay gap.
What this tells us is that the world successfully commodified female education, but utterly failed to compensate it fairly. Women are getting the degrees, entering the workforce, highly skilled.
But this system just automatically devalues their labor.
Exactly. We've spent 30 years saying education is the key to equality, but when women unlock the door, the floor inside is still fundamentally tilted.
It's staggering. And that economic gap naturally bleeds into a power gap, because if you don't hold the capital, you don't hold the leverage.
Which brings us to the GII, the Gender Inequality Index, power and the scales of justice.
Right. Where does the power actually reside?
Let's start with the positive. Globally, maternal mortality has dropped incredibly, from 365 deaths per 100,000 live births down to 216.
That's thousands of women surviving childbirth who wouldn't have before. A beautiful medical victory. But what about political power?
Female parliamentary representation worldwide rose from 11.5% to 26.5%.
So from roughly 1 in 10 lawmakers to about 1 in 4. It's progress. But 26.5% is light years away from the ideal 50%. Why is it so slow?
Because political power is linked to economic power. Look at the labor force participation rate. Globally, female participation is staggeringly low at 47.5%.
Wait, less than half.
Yeah.
Compared to men's 74.1%.
Yeah.
Why? We just said women are more educated. Why aren't they working?
Because the index measures formal, paid labor. It completely ignores the invisible unpaid care economy. Women bear the brunt of raising children, caring for elderly family, managing the household. Uncompensated labor, add to that lack of affordable childcare, and sometimes discriminatory laws.
So picture an unbalanced scale. On one side, physical health and education are getting heavier, more stable, but on the other side, economic independence and political power are just floating in the air.
That's a very apt analogy.
Okay, before we finally get to Liechtenstein, we have to look at the literal Earth we stand on, the PHDI. The hidden ecological cost.
Right. For a long time, the HDI rewarded countries for hyper-industrializing, ignoring the devastating ecological costs.
We were grading humanity on an unlimited curve while burning the classroom down.
Exactly. So the UN introduced the PHDI, and the data is stark. Adjusting for carbon and material footprint shaves off roughly 10% of global human development instantly.
The HDI of 0.756 drops to a PHDI of around 0.68.
Yes. Global carbon emissions are stagnant at about 4.5 tons per capita, but the material footprint...
What's the footprint?
It exploded from 8.6 tons per person in 1990 to 12.7 tons in 2023.
Break down material footprint for us. What does that actually mean?
It's the sheer physical mass of the earth we're extracting. Biomass, fossil fuels, metals, the lithium in your phone, the concrete in your apartment. We extract 12.7 tons of raw earth per human per year.
That is incomprehensible. So if we visualize a scatter plot HDI on the horizontal, PHDI on the vertical, what happens to the highly developed nations?
They slide violently backward, down to the bottom left. High HDI has historically been a planetary death sentence. We cannot all live like wealthy nations do without breaking the planet.
Okay, deep breath. We know the global baseline. Richer, living longer, but plagued by income inequality, a 50% gender pay gap, and eating the planet alive.
Yes.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Enter our outlier, the micro powerhouse, Liechtenstein.
Let's set the stage. It's a tiny, landlocked principality in the Alps. Less than 40,000 people. You could fit the whole country in a football stadium.
But economically, a titan.
Absolute tight.
Their baseline HDI in 2023 is 0.938, ranked 17th globally, the elite tier.
And the specifics are astonishing. Life expectancy is 83.6 years, a full 10 years above the global average.
And the wealth. Gross national income per capita is an eye-watering $166,811.
Right.
That's over 8 times the global average. It sounds like a pure utopian success story. Unlimited resources, world-class healthcare, zero extreme poverty.
They've won the game of economics.
Oh.
But this brings us to the great paradox, the GDI Waterloo.
Because despite being 17th in overall HDI, their Gender Development Index ranks 103rd in the world.
Exactly.
Now, you might be thinking, well, their score is 0.964. That's high. But this is a global ranking. 102 other countries, many with a fraction of their wealth, have a better gender balance.
To understand why, we have to look at the math of the index, specifically the GNI distribution between genders domestically.
Okay, here's the UN data. Female GNI per capita in Liechtenstein, $130,593. Male GNI per capita, $203,514.
There it is.
Wait a second, I need to push back on behalf of our listeners. The women there make 130 grand a year on average. They're richer than almost anyone on the planet. Why does this tank the country's ranking so severely?
It's a brilliant question. It's because these indices aren't about absolute wealth. They are entirely about the ratio of power.
Oh, the ratio.
The GDI severely penalizes the country if its women are significantly less rich than its men. Look at the absolute gap. 203K versus 130K. That's a $73,000 gap every single year.
So a ratio of roughly 0.642?
Yes. Even in a palace, if one person holds significantly more capital, the power dynamic is skewed. The sheer size of that $73,000 gap acts like a lead weight, dragging them to 103rd place.
It's the relativity of power. If a husband makes 200K and a wife 130K, they're comfortable. But if they disagree on a massive financial decision, the one with 200K inevitably has disproportionate leverage.
Exactly.
But is the whole country skewed against women or just the money? What about health and education?
Biologically and socially, Liechtenstein is a stunning model of equality. In 2023, female life expectancy is 85.3 years. Males are at 81.8.
So women notably outlive men, which is standard globally, but both numbers are incredibly high. No gender penalty in healthcare.
None. And education. While male expected years of schooling is slightly higher, 16.4 versus 14.4, the mean years of schooling for women has grown remarkably from 9.6 years in 1990 to 12.4 in 2023.
So the inequality is not biological and not really educational. It's almost purely economic.
It's deeply tied to their labor market structures. Their economy relies on financial services, private banking, precision manufacturing, historically intensely male-dominated sectors, especially at the executive level.
So how does this economic gap reflect in the halls of power? Social empowerment, the GII. Is it a rigid patriarchy?
It's actually a nation in rapid transition. The adolescent birth rate is practically non-existent, 1.7 per 1,000. Total reproductive autonomy.
And political power. Because this stat blew my mind. The share of seats in parliament held by women. In 1990, it was a dismal 4%. How does a developed European nation only have 4% in 1990?
Historical context is crucial here. Women in Liechtenstein didn't even get the right to vote in national elections until 1984, the very last country in Europe.
1984. We had MTV and the space shuttle, and women in a wealthy European nation couldn't vote. That's practically yesterday.
It is, but look at the trajectory. From 4% in 1990, it's steadily climbed. By 2021, female parliamentary representation leaped to 28% and stayed there through 2023.
Going from 4% to 28% in a single generation. It's phenomenal. It shows structural societal change is entirely possible, even in traditional wealthy enclaves.
And look at the labor force. The global gap was 47.5% female versus 74.1% male. But in Liechtenstein, female labor participation is 52.8% against a male participation of 67.2%.
The gap is way smaller, so women are voting, legislating, working, and living long lives.
Exactly.
Which brings us right back to the Waterloo. They're doing everything right, but still making $73,000 less a year. A glass ceiling made of solid Swiss francs.
A profound structural ceiling, but there's one final piece of the puzzle, the planetary reshuffle, the PHDI.
Does Liechtenstein follow the rule that highly developed nations ruin the environment?
They used to. In 1990, per capita carbon emissions were 6.9 tons, way above the global average.
But then what happened over the next 30 years as their wealth exploded?
Their emissions plummeted. By 2023, carbon emissions dropped from 6.9 tons to just 3.97 tons.
Wait, 3.97? That is below the global average of 4.5 tons.
Yeah.
This raises an important question. How did they do it? Did they just outsource dirty manufacturing?
That's part of global trade, but the real mechanism here is decoupling.
Like unhitching a trailer from a truck. Or, actually, it's like upgrading technology. Going from a massive, hot, coal-powered 90s desktop computer to a sleek smartphone that does 1,000 times more work using a fraction of the electricity.
That is a phenomenal analogy. Decoupling is the transition to high-value, low-impact efficiency. Liechtenstein proved you can shoot your GDP straight up while pushing carbon straight down.
How, practically?
By transitioning to knowledge sectors, financial services, intellectual property, precision engineering, high profit, low energy, plus heavy integration with renewable Alpine hydroelectric power.
This proves that extreme wealth doesn't mandate planetary destruction. You can have a 0.938 HDI and respect planetary boundaries.
It's the ultimate proof of concept.
So let's synthesize this all. What does development actually mean going forward? If we build a new pyramid for human development, the bedrock foundation has to be wealth, right? To fund the hospitals and green tech.
Actually, no. Putting wealth at the base is the mistake of the 20th century. The bottom layer, the bedrock, has to be the ecological baseline, the PHDI.
Oh, because without planetary survival, the rest collapses.
Exactly. Low carbon, high development is the only way forward.
Got it. So the middle layer is social equity, the IHDI. Because if wealth isn't distributed equitably, the high score is a mirage. The tilted reservoir has to be leveled.
Precisely. Inequality is the ultimate enemy of progress.
And the top layer.
Individual well-being, the HDI and the GDI, and this is the profound lesson of Liechtenstein. Income is not a magic wand.
That's the huge takeaway. Extreme wealth can still hide deep gender divides in resource allocation. You can have 85-year life expectancies and $130,000 average incomes and still have a 35% structural economic disadvantage.
Because parity has to be engineered. It requires intentional policy to confront invisible cultural biases.
So human development is no longer just about surviving. It's about surviving equitably and sustainably.
And that leads us to a final thought. Behind every decimal point is a human life.
So we'll leave you, the listener, with a final provocation. If a country like Liechtenstein, with basically unlimited resources, zero poverty, and a tiny population, still struggles to close the gender wealth gap, what does that say about the invisible biases embedded in modern capitalism?
As we build the economies of the future, can true equality be achieved simply by creating more wealth? Or do we have to completely redesign how we value labor itself?
This is a massive question. Thank you for coming along on this deep dive with us. We encourage you to look at the rich countries in your own region through this multidimensional lens. Look past the GDP and keep questioning.